first question I would ask in our first hearing in this series, we learned about ISIS's horrific use of sexual violence to devastate families, to devastate communities. But the Assad regime's prisons are notorious also for the unbelievable level of rape and torture. We had Caesar, the military photographer, who documented some of this, testify here. So you have thousands and thousands of Syrian women who've been imprisoned in those jails, in Assad's jails, many simply for organizing aid deliveries or rescue operations that defied Assad's blockades. So, Ms. McWilliams, you've been helping to train Syrian women who are now participated in this latest round of the UN brokered talks. In a traditional society like Syria, where even the suspicion of rape can break families apart, can you speak a little about the importance of women's inclusion to address the long-term effects of widespread sexual violence in conflict?
Thank you very much, Chairman. And let me give you a picture of what it was like last month when I was with the women. And word came from Riyadh that there may be some detainees going to be released as a confidence-building measure in order to get the talks started. And so we asked the women to sit down and consider which women would be on a list if they were to be released. And therein lay the first problem. There was a documented list and a non-documented list. And the women started to argue about whether they could switch some of the women who were undocumented because their parents had come to the women and said to them, "We do not want anyone to know that our daughters are inside Assad's prisons, because when they get out, this will be an issue of their honor." And so the women had to carefully negotiate that night which women would go on the list and be sent back as a confidence-building measure before the talks would start, that a number of them would be released, both women and children. And that, for me, coming from a different culture, was a real lesson. So the issue of sexual violence is horrendous. There were women in the room who had experienced sexual assaults and who had been raped in all-male prisons and who couldn't speak. And they also said other women got up and expressed their solidarity towards them and apologized to them and said, "We are so sorry that you were left alone. But again, we in the community were told not to single you out in case this word came out that you were there." So you can see the difficulties, Chairman. And this is what I meant when I was giving my testimony about the differential impact of conflict on men and women's lives. The other issues that we're facing are in the refugee camps. The women were telling us that in some of these camps, ISIS were trying to take the camps over. They were incredibly courageous, incredibly resilient, and they were refusing to let that happen. There were some concerns about the Sharia courts being used to make judgments on very young girls who they knew to be raped. And so that was also an issue. But what they're doing, and I think is incredibly important, and what we did too, was they're documenting all of this so that these human rights violations will be on the record. There should be no impunity for such incredible sexual violations. And they're making sure that one day, if transitional justice comes about, that these issues will get the priority, which in the past, as you know, in the Second World War, they did not.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Ms. O'Neill, although Ms. Bagombi was not able to join us today, I know you're familiar with her very successful work with Ugandan women to encourage a large number of defections from the Lord's Resistance Army, where Joseph Kony had captured children, the girls for concubines, the boys for child soldiers, for him and his lieutenants. I find this kind of community outreach very compelling and potentially very relevant to other conflicts in which it's very clear that we need to be smarter about countering this kind of extremist recruitment. For example, Al-Qaeda or ISIS in particular, or Daesh. Can you speak a little more about what these kinds of initiatives mean in terms of the untapped potential for women in many places where we're trying to counteract this terrorist recruitment that's underway? And I'd afterwards ask Mr. Abbas for any insights, any comments he might have as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You referenced Betty Bigombe's work briefly to describe, for example, one of the things that she did. She organized groups of women to write letters to LRA combatants, to LRA soldiers, explaining what would happen to them, what services would be available to them, what programs they could access, were they to voluntarily demobilize, come out of the bush, and rejoin their communities. They handwrote these letters, and they had their female family members, wives, friends, deliver them directly. So Betty organized a group of other women to do this. They did so in a way that appeared non-threatening, non-political. No one assumed that they were doing anything scary because they were a group of women organizing. They created these letters, delivered them, and as a result, 2,000 members of the LRA voluntarily demobilized. Can you imagine the cost savings and the savings in human lives from that not being a military action or a forced demobilization? And that's exactly the type of creative solution that women around the world are using. Women that we speak with and work with around the world talk about the importance of having women in all aspects of decision-making regarding government and other programs aimed at countering violent extremism, so that women are not viewed solely as victims who need protection or the provision of services from the state, but who are also providers of services and who have agency in their own. Noting to us that one of the ways that some women are actually attracted to these violent extremist movements are by false promises of agency, of being a lioness in some senses, of being targeted for the opportunity to make a change or a difference. And so the importance of providing an alternative narrative for hope, for a role in determining their country's future, et cetera. And the more women you have engaged in the upstream program design and upstream thinking, including in security forces, the more women you are going to be affected and actually authentically reached by these outreach efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Abbas.
So it's reference to both the points. I would substantiate that in some examples especially from the case of Pakistan and also from Iraq. But in case of Pakistan, for instance, we know that when in one case, Swat, where the militants had taken over around 2009, if you remember, we knew that they're about 100 miles, a 1-hour drive from Islamabad. And when that whole episode of the rise of extremism and militancy was studied, we came to know that some of the militants in that area, Fazlullah, who's now head of the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, or Pakistani Taliban, he was specifically targeting women because he was using his radio transmissions during the daytime when he knew full well that men are mostly out in the farms or in the field, and that he would inspire and somehow women who are at home, who are listening to radio. The research came out 3 years later because no one was, and there was a group of women who were actually involved in finding that out. So that substantiates the point that even when in these cases where extremists and terrorists and radicals try to use all channels available, somehow in case of South Asia, it is women, whether they were human rights activists or whether they were from the law enforcement or security agencies, when I'm saying, I'm thinking again because there are so few, but those who are in the civil society. Civil society in Pakistan and Iraq has played an important role. Also, an example, recently, we had a young woman from Iraq, actually, who came at College of International Security Affairs at NDU and spoke about that her father was a Shia and mother was a Sunni, and how she was working in Iraq now to bring both the sectarian groups together. So there's a lot of evidence. It is an issue of empowering them. And if I make just quote in brief one of my colleagues, a British police officer who I've quoted in statement in length, she had said we often forget that we talk about equipping women and we talk about empowering them, but it is also about, at the end of the day, enabling them. And that enabling role is mostly in the hands of men, whether it is about towards the extremism or the other side. So we have to focus on the enabling part.
Women and girls like Malala. Thank you, Dr. Abbas. We go now to Mr. Sherman, the ranking member.